Hello, my name is Andrew Fisher. I'm a civil engineer with the City of Greeley Public Works Department, and I'm also the acting floodplain administrator for the city. Thank you for joining me in this webinar on floodplains. Specifically, this webinar is discussing the city's public outreach in regards to the Cache la Poudre River floodplain risk map, which includes an update to the flood insurance rate maps and flood insurance study for our community. These new floodplain products are coming to northeastern Colorado and are on track for adoption by early 2022. This webinar is intended to provide information for property owners, developers, and community members that may or may not be affected by these updates. The purpose of this webinar is to provide background on why this study was completed and who's driving it, as well as provide a summary of the process and schedule. I'll discuss some of the results from the proposed floodplain risk map changes and go over some insurance and development implications. We've included some additional resources for your use and an outline of the next steps in the process. We do want to have an open discussion with our citizens. Unfortunately, due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, we're unable to have an open house public meeting. This webinar will stand in to provide information to the community. In addition, on Wednesday, December 2nd at 6 p.m., we'll hold a public Q&A via Zoom to answer any general floodplain risk map questions. If you have specific questions about a specific property, I'm available for a phone call, online meeting, or email to discuss your specific property questions. Here's the outline for this webinar. First, I wanted to provide context to floodplains in Greeley by going through Greeley's flood history on the Cache la Poudre River. Chances are it may not be what you expect. I'll present background on the project and the National Flood Insurance Program. I'll touch on the timeline of the remapping study and how it was performed. Once we understand how and why the mapping products were produced, I'll present a brief evaluation of the new floodplain mapping products and what it means in our community. Finally, I'll discuss flood insurance, appeals, and provide other resources and next steps for the process. Greeley's experienced several floods on the Poudre River, some of them in recent memory. In the summer of 2014, the Poudre experienced a rapid snowmelt event. This caused the river to escape the riverbanks, flooding areas such as 6th Avenue, shown on the left. The flow rate for that flood was measured at approximately 4,500 CFS, or roughly a 10 to 25 year flood. What is a CFS? CFS stands for cubic feet per second. 1 cubic foot is approximately 1 5-gallon bucket. So 4,500 CFS is like 4,500 5-gallon buckets flowing by you every second. The September 2013 flood is extremely well known in northeastern Colorado. It caused significant damage on the Big Thompson River, St. Vrain, and in the South Platte floodplains. However, for all the flooding experienced that year, Greeley did not experience a significant flood on the Cache la Poudre River. At 4,300 CFS, it was actually smaller than the flood experienced less than 12 months later. So, while many communities suffered from a 100-year flood and higher, the Poudre was not a 100-year flood. In fact, it was in the range of a 10 to 25-year flood. While it's rare, note we did receive 2 10 to 25-year floods within 12 months. As pictured on the left, once again, is the 6th Avenue area downtown, and on the bottom, 71st Avenue, near the river. Near the end of April and into May of 1999, the Poudre flooded to the tune of 6,600 CFS, larger than the 25-year flood. During this event, floodwaters escaped the banks and overtopped Highway 85 near 8th Street. 1983 is commonly cited as a major flood in Greeley, and indeed more than 6,100 CFS was measured in that event, approximately a 25-year flood. Pictured to the left is Highway 85, stretching to the south and upper left of the photo. East 8th Street is going to the east and bottom left. The wastewater treatment plant and several properties along East 8th Street were inundated by floodwaters, and the flood did overtop Highway 85 at 8th Street. The Greeley Tribune archives documented a flood of approximately 3,500 CFS in 1965, which resulted in flooding in Greeley for multiple months. This was approximately a 10-year event. And in 1904, Greeley experienced a big flood. In fact, it was referred to as the Big Flood. It was so large that it was featured in a USGS report in 1905 of major flooding events nationwide in 1904. This flood, which at one point resulted in a dozen homes floating by a farm in an hour, caused over $400 million in damages as converted to present-day dollars. This flood was estimated to be 18,000 cubic feet per second, significantly higher than any flood experienced since. Based upon this statistical data, it's estimated that the 100-year flood is 10,500 CFS. There are a few things to take from this. One, the Poudre has experienced approximately 4 25-year floods in the last 100 years. That seems to pass the smell test. We've experienced approximately 10 10-year floods in the last 100 years as well. That seems to make sense as well. We've not experienced a 100-year flood in the last 100 years, though. That means nobody living in Greeley at this point has seen a flood of the magnitude depicted on its rate maps. That doesn't mean we won't see it. We saw a much larger flood just over 100 years ago. It may only be a matter of time before we see a 100-year flood on the Cache la Poudre River, particularly given to the damage of the watershed from this year's wildfires. Next, I'll talk about the National Flood Insurance Program and the Risk Map Project background. This presentation is meant to answer several questions that typically come up and get everyone on the same page. Flood risk is important, and it can affect our lives. While we were largely spared in 2013 and 2014, we did witness area communities get devastated. Flood risk is also just not static. Development, technological analysis improvements, and natural changes alter flood risk and what we know flood risk to be. That's why these studies occur and are updated. We want to ensure that we have the updated flood risk estimates to aid in mitigating the flood hazards responsibly, to protect life, health, and safety in our community. To do this, most communities are part of the NFIP, or the National Flood Insurance Program. Greeley's no different. The NFIP requires that communities follow certain requirements for development and construction activity. In response, the community receives administration report, new floodplain maps, flood insurance for property owners, and federal assistance for flood mitigation projects and disaster relief. The NFIP is a voluntary program. Greeley is not forced by federal law to be a part of it. However, nearly every municipality with a regulatory floodplain in Colorado is an NFIP member. This allows homeowners to buy insurance based on the zones that they're in the flood maps. It's a federal program overseen by FEMA and their partners, managed by communities like the City of Greeley. It's enforced by lenders on federally backed mortgages. Water resources engineers determine the risk, which is used to determine the requirements on given properties. It also allows for discounts for areas of less risk. There are many entities that go into partnering to create this program. Community officials like myself administer the NFIP, communicate risk and changes to it, manage construction and development in the floodplain, adapt to flood risk, enforce the federal, state, and municipal regulations, identify areas where risk has changed based on natural effects or development, and communicate with the public. The state of Colorado Department of Natural Resources has a division called the Colorado Water Conservation Board. They, along with CDOT, assist as being state departments to move towards getting updated floodplains. They initiate risk identification updates, assist communities in regulating floodplains. They're a partner with the city, and they respond to community requests to update flood insurance rate maps. We can request to the state to have a floodplain updated, and if it is needed, they will be on our side to go to FEMA to get these updated. The Federal Emergency Management Agency is, or FEMA, is the national agency overseeing the NFIP. They include all of the study on the firms, they vet all of the engineering, and they provide the funding for the study. Additional private stakeholders can also be a stakeholder with this. Developers and property owners may alter the floodplain with their development projects. They would work with community officials to ensure that the flood risk maps are updated. One entity not yet mentioned is in the bottom right of your screen, AECOM, which is the state's engineering contractor doing all of the heavy lifting and modeling for this study. Next, I'll discuss how the study was performed and the study timeline. This study consists of revised floodplains for the Cache la Poudre River in Colorado, plus the Big Thompson, South Platte, St. Vrain, Box Elder Creek, and several other creeks. However, in the city of Greeley, the Cache la Poudre is the one predominantly affected. Pictured here is the current regulatory Poudre River floodplain along the northern extent of Greeley, as adopted in January 2016. As shown, the light blue is the flood fringe portion of the floodplain, and the pink is the floodway. I'll discuss what that means more in a bit. These projects take a long time. There is significant work, field work, engineering work, public outreach, and review comments from communities and FEMA before a flood study is adopted. In fact, this study was initiated all the way back in 2010. The first step in the study is to develop a terrain model, a topographical digital elevation model which shows how water would flow downstream within the basin. The current regulatory floodplain adopted in 2016 was based upon topography from the late 1980s and early 1990s. This new study is based upon topography from 2013, after the flood, as flown by an airplane and collected as LiDAR. This terrain is then supplemented by field survey, which captures topography where LiDAR can't, such as under the water surface, at bridge openings, and under trees. Next, hydrology estimates the amount of water expected in the 100-year flood. Then the engineer merges the hydrology and terrain into a hydraulic model to compute how the flow travels through the watershed. Finally, the model is transferred to a mapping product depicting the extent of the flooding on an aerial image. These products were completed and provided as preliminary to communities in September of this year. As mentioned on this slide, all of this data is publicly available for download on FEMA's website. As for the schedule, as previously mentioned, these documents were released as preliminary in September. Typically with these studies, 1 month later, there would be a meeting with community officials. This also occurred in September of this year. Usually 2 months after preliminary release, the community will have a public outreach. That is what this webinar is entailing. Then a 90-day appeal period is heard once the study is posted to the Federal Register. This typically occurs 4 months after preliminary release, which would set this at approximately February 2021. However, this could occur anytime between December of this year and March of next year. Once those appeals have been heard and resolved, the letter of final determination is issued, which starts a clock of 6 months for communities to adopt the floodplains. Given this, final adoption of the new maps are expected in approximately December 2021 to March 2022, sometime in that time frame. This has been a lot of background, so what people really want to know is the results and how it affects them. Let's get into that next. First, do results depict actual flooding? Despite our best efforts, no, they don't always. Actual floods can be different every time. They can be dam breaks. Bridges and culverts could clog. There could be additional debris. Models are based on the conditions from the topographic data and survey that were collected as part of the study. These can change. Models are best on the base available information at the time. Some things may change. Results of the study could change based on topography changes, updated modeling techniques, or different definitions of things like the regulatory floodway. We'll get into that again here later. Here's an example of a flood insurance rate map. Pictured in the red oval at the top says Zone AE. This is typically the 100-year floodplain with a base flood elevation assigned. This is in the flood fringe. The red and teal hatched area is a regulatory floodway. As pictured on this map, it says 1% annual chance flood. This does not say 100-year flood. I've been using the term 100-year flood because that's what people are most comfortable with. However, the industry is moving away from this as it seems to suggest to people that a 100-year flood occurs once every 100 years. Statistically, that's not how it works. There could be 100-year flood this year and the next year. We might not see one for 500 years. More accurately, we have a 1% chance each year of seeing a flood of this magnitude. In that same vein, the orange area is what used to be referred to as the 500-year flood. It is now called the 0.2 annual chance flood. Flood insurance rate maps are available on FEMA Map Service Center and the FEMA National Flood Hazard Layer. Now to floodways. Floodplains are broken up into two main components, floodways and flood fringe. The flood fringe is an area of lower depth, lower velocity, and lower overall risk. This zone is less likely to be flooded in events less than the 100-year flood. This is usually found on the outside or the fringe of the floodplain. Development in this zone may even have minimal impact on adjacent properties. As such, regulations allow filling in this zone with development as long as construction's above the 100-year water surface elevation for insurable structures. The regulatory floodway in the middle of the floodplain is a higher risk, higher depth, higher velocity zone, which is also more prone to flooding in events less than the 100-year. As a result, there's higher regulations associated with floodways that require you to prove any project and development does not impact your neighbor. So how do we know where that line is between the fringe and the floodway? Engineers assume an allowance for complete development of the flood fringe. When that occurs, the same amount of water is trying to travel through a smaller area. As a result, the water surface area or water surface elevation will increase. When determining floodway boundaries, engineers squeeze in the floodplain from the outside until that surcharges 1 foot. At that point, a floodway line is drawn. However, in 2010, the state of Colorado passed a new regulation that is more stringent. In Colorado, only a 6-inch surcharge is permitted. As a result, less fill can be placed before the floodplain surcharge is 6 inches than 12 inches. We would then expect wider floodways and smaller floodplains as a result. Any work in the floodway, construction, or development must prove no adverse impact on all neighboring properties. This is a higher bar than being in the flood fringe. Depicted on the top left is a current regulatory floodplain map adopted in 2016 with a floodway defined based on the 1 foot surcharge federal regulation. Below is the preliminary risk map. In comparison, the overall floodplain is similar, but the floodway does indeed increase. In tabular form, we find that parcels in the floodplain in Greeley actually decrease in total with the new map, but parcels in the floodway increase quite a bit. Preliminary evaluations of structures suggest a large increase in buildings in the floodway, while structures in the floodplain overall is approximately the same. Please note that these are approximate counts. The city does possess a database of parcels extracted from maps to show which parcels are in current conditions and future floodplain conditions. You can consult the city's floodplain administrator to get this information. So who is at risk of flooding? It's important to note that a line on a map is not definite. It's our best guess for what data is available and what engineering technology produces. It's a line on a map. It's not the real extent of a 100-year flood necessarily. Scientific process does allow for changes in the floodplain. But note that you may still be at risk of flooding even if you're outside of the floodplain. There's hundreds of residents from 2013 and 14 who would tell you that. So what now? Property owners may want to access various resources on floodplains, insurance, and appeals. It's important to know that there are no new laws or requirements based on these map changes. Property owners may experience new regulations or insurance requirements based on being mapped into a new special flood hazard area. That's not because engineers created the risk. The risk was always there. We just have better data and modeling to show where it is. The NFIP does require flood insurance for federally backed mortgages in any special flood hazard area listed as A, AE, AH, or AO. However, banks and lenders can require this anywhere. Flood insurance is available anywhere in the city because you still can flood. That line does not stop flooding. It's not a levee. Insurance is required for federal assistance after floods, and this is important to understand. If you've paid off your home and no longer wish to pay for flood insurance, you will be ineligible for federal assistance if you suffer a loss from floods. It's also important to know that the new zones do not go into effect until the flood insurance rate maps are effective in roughly early 2022. While we have this information now, it's for your benefit to understand and evaluate going forward, because there may be some grandfathering that you may be able to take advantage of, but these are not being imposed upon you at this time. If you are a property owner that's being mapped into a higher risk area, it is recommended that you get a preferred risk policy before it comes effective. Flood insurance is offered at a lower premium outside of the regulatory floodplain. You can start paying that premium now in the time before this floodplain map becomes effective. Once it comes effective, you get to carry that premium forward until that starts to increase again. If you're removed from a special flood hazard area, that does not mean that your property has no risk. You may still have flooding risk. It may be recommended, and you may consider converting your policy to a preferred risk policy after the floodplain maps go effective. There may be a change in base flood elevation on your property, which could trigger some grandfathering. For development implications, the community ordinance specifies what is required. The City of Greeley does indeed have a community ordinance and floodplain municipal code. These meet the minimum requirements set forth by state regulations and federal regulations. Nothing more stringent is required in the City of Greeley above the state requirements. With these increased floodway areas, it's important to understand that there are different requirements if you are located in a floodway versus a non-floodway. Communities may adopt this preliminary mapping document as best available data and regulate to it if it is more stringent than what is existing now. The City of Greeley has elected not to do this and will regulate to the more stringent rules only when required at adoption in 2022. Can results be changed? Yes, they can under certain circumstances, and there are 3 different types of major changes that can occur from this point. The first and the most simple is comments. Comments may include street names that are mislabeled, spelling errors, anything of that nature. We can provide comments and get those changed so you don't have a misspelled street name on your map. For substantive changes, there must be an appeal or a letter of map change. For appeals, successful appeals must show demonstrably better data. Appeals are not going to be successful based upon anecdotes or photographs of historic flooding on the Poudre, especially considering we've not had a 100-year flood in the last 100 years. Past discussions with administrators with FEMA, the CWCB, the county, the city, or any other engineers also are not valid sources of appeals. Letter of map changes include letters of map revisions, which are engineering studies, or letter of map amendments, which may be based upon updated survey to adjust the map and must be funded by the property owner. Keep in mind, these flood maps are based on the 100-year floods. We do experience floods less than 100-year, and you may have experienced it on your property. Specifically for appeals, the public must submit comments and appeal data to the community. Do not submit any of this directly to FEMA. The community must review these submittals for completeness and consideration as an appeal, and then package all community appeals in one package and send it to FEMA. FEMA will confirm that they've received that from the city and mail a formal acknowledgement to the community. Again, this appeal process takes 90 days and may take longer depending on the validity of some appeals provided. For letter of map change options, letter of map revisions tie into the preliminary model as currently published. An engineer could be hired to do better engineering, better survey and engineering, or a construction project which will alter the floodplain in a location. If this is done, this can be submitted now to FEMA and reviewed and approved. However, any letter of map revisions on the preliminary data will not go into effect until this study is published and adopted in 2022. Additionally, property owners may have had a letter of map amendment wherein shown on the map their structure is in the floodplain, but their structure is indeed elevated above the base flood elevation. If a letter of map amendment had been previously produced, this could be validated with a SOMA, which is a summary of map amendments. I would recommend checking that database to see if you have been revalidated in that situation. It's possible that a letter of map amendment would not be revalidated in the condition in which a base flood elevation changed. In this situation, you may need to resubmit a LOMA. There are several resources at your disposal, personal contacts, including the local floodplain administrator, myself, state study leads, flood insurance representatives, and FEMA representatives. Their contacts will be shown on the last slide. Additionally, the FloodSmart website is FEMA's website for floodplains. The CWCB has a very good website listed here to go to the state flood page. And the City of Greeley has produced a new floodplain website listed with that URL. Additionally, the ColoradoHazardMapping.com website, which has been appearing at the bottom of each slide, is an exceptional resource for looking at locations in this risk map. Go to this URL, click on the flood hazard tile on the left, and it will open up this screen. In the homeowner area, you can enter your address anywhere in Colorado and get information about your specific parcel. County flood information includes several things at each of these counties. If you're interested in anything outside of the City of Greeley, you can click on the Weld County link and look along the Poudre, the Platte, the Big Thompson, or several other rivers in Weld County. Additionally, tutorials and fact sheets are posted on their website. Let's use a quick example and enter 920 A Street in Greeley under the Homeowner Report field. This is the Rodarte Center owned by the City of Greeley. If you put that in, it will produce a homeowner report showing an exhibit with the existing floodplain on the left and the preliminary floodplain coming in 2022 on the right. This will show which zone you are in currently and in the future. It will also point out the elevation of anticipated flooding in the 100-year event and the percent chance of flooding in a 30-year mortgage. In this instance, we would expect the Rodarte Center to flood 26% of the time over the next 30 years. In conclusion, results show risk that's already there. Nobody created a floodplain out of thin air. This is better information, and we are trying to capture the risk as best as we can. All of this data is used for flood insurance rate maps, which dictate the insurance premiums on required insurance policies. It's very critical to understand that floodplains are not effective until the flood insurance rate maps are released and adopted in early 2022. I urge you to ask any questions you may have about floodplains to me or to any of the additional contacts provided at the end of this presentation. Additionally, as previously mentioned, we will accept general questions at a public Q&A Zoom meeting on Wednesday, December 2nd at 6 p.m. The link to that Zoom meeting will be posted on Greeley's Floodplain website. Any questions pertaining to a specific property should be directed directly to the City Floodplain Administrator via email, phone call, or to set up a Zoom meeting with me. Project contacts, here are my contacts with my cell phone number, my email address, and the City of Greeley Floodplain website. At state and federal level, Matt Buddy is a tremendous resource with FEMA as a floodplain management and insurance specialist. Doug Mahan is the Community Assistance Coordinator with the CWCB. Marta Blanco Castaño is the Floodplain Mapping Program Assistant with the state. And Chris Gaines is the FEMA Region 8 Civil Engineer. And with that, I want to thank you for spending time with me on this webinar. And I look forward to conferring with you via email, phone, or Zoom, or during the December 2nd Q&A.